Now that you know the basics and getting started with HTML5, with writing your first HTML5 document, I'm going to teach you about the key transitions that you need to be aware of when moving your HTML4 and XHTML1 documents over to HTML5. The first of these is that you really got to remove all that presentational markup. The second is there are a number of features in HTML4 that have unfortunately failed on the web as they were intended, and so HTML5 removes these features and you need to remove them from your content as well. Third, how to maintain compatibility. HTML5 is here in various forms and various browsers. However, there are still some older browsers that require some quirky, shall we say, coding techniques. Cover a couple of those that you might need to be aware of depending on what browsers you need to support. Next, there are bits and pieces of HTML that aren't necessarily failed, but they're kind of obsolete. We've developed better techniques over the years, and so HTML5 formalizes some of these better techniques, and I'm going to teach you how to make those transitions as well. HTML4 and XHTML deprecated almost all presentational markup, which was a wonderful thing because it ushered in the renaissance of CSS-based websites that have even more beautiful presentations, and semantic markup that's good for users, good for web applications, good for browsers, good for search engines, etc. All right, let's get into this. Plain text tag. I doubt many of you have seen this or use it, but if you do, you need to start using the pre-tag instead. Everything to do with fonts, you need to not have in your markup anymore, whether it's base font, the big tag, the font tag, or the TT tag. You need to drop those and switch instead to just using the CSS font properties. They work much better, they're much more powerful, and they're much more maintainable. You might be wondering, what about the small tag? Well, we'll get to that in a later section. Anything to do with text decorations, strikes, strike-throughs, underlines, all of these are replaced by the CSS text decoration property. Alignment and centering. The center tag has been deprecated for quite some time. CSS techniques for centering work great, people understand them, as well as alignment. So whether you're aligning center or if you're doing align left or align right, so either use text align or margin auto for blocks, or if you're floating things using align, like image align, you need to be using the CSS float property for those. There's still some attributes on the body element that are presentational as well. Link, A-link, V-link. If you've never used these, you're lucky. But if you're a long-time web developer, you might have used these to change the color of links on the page. You don't need to be doing that anymore. Universal across all modern browsers is good support of CSS pseudoclasses, :link, :visited, and the color property. It's really easy to replace those. Next, there are a number of features in HTML4 that have failed, unfortunately, and HTML5 removes them and makes them not part of the language anymore. So you need to drop them for various reasons. The first is the long desk attribute. There's kind of a sad story here because long desk was really intended to help enable accessibility. But this attribute, though, unfortunately, just did not do the trick because, first of all, it was invisible. Nobody really implemented it except for maybe a few obscure user agents or maybe some accessibility tools. The problem with that is that because it was hidden in this attribute, in the image tag that no one ever saw, it really rotted. Like people that used it for the wrong thing. For example, do you know what goes in long desk attribute? Is it a text description? Is it a URL? It's not obvious, is it, from just the name of it? Well, it takes a URL. Well, a lot of people would just put in literally a long description of the image. That seems natural, but that's not what it's for. So this attribute's broken, it's failed. If you were using long desk attribute, what you should do instead is just include a visible description, visible long description with the image that helps all users and not just those that can't see the images as well. Or if we don't want to include a visible full description, include a hyperlink next to the image saying longer description of this image. If you need to hide that with CSS, you can go ahead and do so. In either case, there are a number of alternative techniques that you can be using today. Okay, this is a big one. Everything to do with frame sets and frames, you just got to drop. These have been known to break the web in numerous ways for a long time. I think we can blame the original browser wars for introducing these tags in the first place. Well, thankfully HTML5 has dropped them and gotten rid of them. It's time to drop them from any and all sites you're using as well. This really means that if you were using them, you need to redesign your site to not use them any longer. I guarantee that when you do that, you're going to get accessibility and usability gains just by switching away from frames. If you still need to embed some content that's HTML inside your HTML, like in a nested way, that's in a separate file, you can use iframes to do that. Even then, I would caution against it. It's not the best technique, but it's a transitional technique that you can make use of. Here's another attribute you probably didn't even know existed, the version attribute on the HTML element. What does it do? Almost no one knows, because browsers never actually did anything with it. So if you happen to use that in your code, just get rid of it. It wasn't doing anything anyway. More failed features. The scheme attribute of the meta tag is one that, aside from obscure informaticians and maybe some semantic web folks, no one ever really used. It just does not have practical use on the real World Wide Web. And that's because, frankly, as part of the meta tag in general, it's invisible metadata. And if there's one lesson that we've learned over the past 10 years, it's that invisible metadata should be avoided because it's a waste of time, it gets corrupted, it rots over time. There's tons of documentation that describes why invisible metadata has failed. In fact, the top search engines like Yahoo and Google, they ignore meta keywords, for example. And yet you find tons of SEO snake oil salesmen just incorporating that into part of their pitches and what to do to your pages. You don't need it. So just drop meta scheme and drop anything similar to that. If you want to incorporate metadata in your document, keep it visible, keep it indexable, and keep it up to date. Once you have that visible content in your document, add microformats to it so that it's semantically marked up so that browsers can do things with it, search engines can recognize and index it. And that's really the direction that semantic markup is moving across the whole spectrum of folks developing for the web. This next attribute that's been dropped has really caused quite a bit of controversy, unfortunately, and that's the rev attribute. I'm sad to say that the rev attribute does actually have some uses. For example, the vote links microformat makes use of it. However, all the studies that have been done to date, the studies that Google has done, the informal studies that have been done with web designers and web authors, informal surveys, in fact, and even my own experience in teaching, the rev attribute is just too confusing. It's often misunderstood. People use it when they think they mean rel, they mix the two up, so HTML5 drops it. If you were using the rev attribute for anything, take a look at equivalent rel microformats instead. We believe we've solved most of these problems with microformats. If you have a use of the rev attribute that you think is still necessary, join the microformats community, discuss your problem, and I'm sure we can come up with a workaround. There's a couple of things I need to talk about for maintaining compatibility with much older browser implementations. The first is, with the script tag, you no longer actually have to say what the language or the type or anything of the script is. Because what is the script that we all use today in our web pages? We use JavaScript, right? That battle was fought long ago and has been over for a long time. If you're using a script on a web page, it's JavaScript. It's not going to be some other kind of script. HTML5 formalizes this and says if you just have a script tag, it's JavaScript. But if you're still using or supporting browsers that are old, perhaps say 10 years old, you may need to indicate explicitly the type of the language. And if you do, you can do so with a type attribute. Type equals, quote, text/JavaScript. And that's all you should do. You shouldn't use this for anything else. If you include a type attribute, include it like this, and don't worry about it. The nice thing is that because it's basically just restating the obvious, that you're using JavaScript, you can just leave it in there. It's harmless, it's fine, it's not going to cause any trouble in the future. The second is, this is one of the very few presentational artifacts left in HTML5, and that's the border attribute of the image tag. And that's because in some older browsers that don't support CSS, we're talking really old now, what they do is they put these blue links around images that are hyperlinked. And developers for a long time have been including the directive or the attribute border equals 0 to get rid of the blue borders around those links. And that's something that HTML5 has formalized and said it's okay. You can still have a border attribute on the image tag, but only if you set it to 0. Any other use of the border attribute has now become invalid. So this is simply a technique to maintain compatibility. And again, you can leave it in there if you'd like. It's not going to cause any damage long term. That's something else that might be deprecated eventually, but when it is, you'll find it when you validate your document. Again, there's going to be no long-term bad effects of that. So let's talk about XHTML. Now, to date, most web authors have been using HTML4 or equivalents. A lot of folks, myself included, made the transition to XHTML in the early 2000s, along with the transition from, frankly, transitional markup to strict markup. And so we really advocated using XHTML strict with semantic markup, and modern web designers and modern web design magazines and articles all advocated this direction. And it really resulted in a cleaner, more semantic web for a lot of folks. Well, you can continue to use XHTML with HTML5. And you may wonder, well, how do you do that? A lot of the techniques that were developed for keeping XHTML compatible with even HTML4 are still valid. So what this means is, first of all, you have to self-close empty HTML4 tags explicitly. For example, the following tags: meta, link, the break tag, horizontal rule, image, input, and option are all empty in markup parlance, which means that there is no closed tag. There is no separate closed tag. There's only attributes in the tag. So when you use any one of these, put that closing slash at the end of the tag to indicate that it is an empty tag. And this will allow your content to continue to be processed as XHTML. This is okay and allowable in HTML5, and I encourage it if you want to maintain XHTML compatibility. The second is always use quoted attribute values. And actually, this is a recommendation that I make to anyone that authors HTML. Even though it's one of those things that you need for XHTML, I think it's something you should do regardless, because it really helps avoid errors. Here's an example. If you say image source equals photo1.jpg, now you're really depending on the browser to be intelligent about realizing when does the value of the attribute start and when does it finish. If you put quotes around it, and there I've added the slash as well to indicate the image is an empty element, it maintains compatibility with XHTML and it avoids errors. If you happen to have, for example, the name of an attribute as part of the name of your image and there was a space inserted, your image might not be recognized. So this is just one of those coding techniques that's compatible and just encourages good code and fewer errors. The errors that impact you the least are the ones that you never write. So go ahead and always use quoted attribute values. Now you may be wondering, when I showed you the doc type and meta care set for HTML5, where are the HTML tags, or the head tag, or body tag, and all that? If this is all you need to start an HTML document, where are the rest of those? Well, the reality is that all you need, in addition to those tags, is a title, and then any other content. So for example, a paragraph. You actually don't need a body or a head tag or an HTML tag in HTML5. You didn't really need them in HTML4 either, but they were encouraged to keep the document clear, to have a consistent start and beginning, end, and all that. Well, for XHTML compatibility, one of the things that you should include for what they call a consistent document object model are all the tags explicitly. So in this case, we take that doc type HTML example and we add the HTML tag around the entire thing, right? So doc type HTML, and then we have our head tags, open and close, around the meta car set and the required title tag, and then we have the body tag as well. It's a little bit more typing or a little bit more of a template, but it's a small price to pay to keep your XHTML documents valid and still usable as XHTML. Another common example where people run into this is in tables. So myself and many others, we write really simple tables. All we have is a table with a few rows and a few cells, and all you really need for that are the table, TR, and TD elements. However, if you want to maintain document object model compatibility with how this is interpreted in XHTML versus HTML, then you need to explicitly include a T-body tag around all your rows. Just think of it as part of the table tag that you're creating. So when you do open table, do an open T-body, do all the rest of the table rows and table cells you would mark up, and then a closed T-body and a closed table. Later on, if you want to make use of some of the more advanced table features like T-head and T-foot, you can do so because it's already clear where they should go. But for now, just consider when you're creating these valid semantic tables, none of you should be using tables for layout now, right? Include T-body and close T-body inside the table. Next, There are bits and pieces of obsolete markup that have remained in HTML4 that HTML5 finally drops because we figured out how to get rid of them. We figured out how to transition away. The first of those is the acronym tag. Oh boy, I cannot count the number of hours and number of email messages wasted discussing whether I should use an acronym or an ABBR for a particular usage. And so if anything, at least it's going to finally put an end to all those arguments. Frankly, just use the ABBR tag instead. You don't need to use the acronym tag. It's gone. Don't use it anymore. If you had any, just change them to ABBR. Search and replace. Don't even think twice about it. Don't ask yourself why you made a decision in the first place. Don't go reopen those rat holes. Second, the applet tag. This was popular in the 90s when people were trying to publish Java applets as part of their web pages. Well, a lot of the web has sort of moved on from publishing Java applets, though there may be still a few out there. If you're still doing so, or if you have a specific need to publish a Java applet in your web pages, you need to follow the direction that HTML4 set and use the object element instead. There are details for doing this, documented on the web. Lots of folks have techniques, so depending on your application, you'll find a way to do this. But the short answer, drop your applet tags and switch to using the object tag, which is valid HTML5. Next, there's a dir tag that has been around since a very long time for directories and directory listings, and this has been dropped from HTML5 as well. Instead, just go ahead and use it on unordered list. If you need to style it differently, use CSS. This is a big change that has occurred, and it's about time. HTML in the early days encouraged named anchors to give you little spots in the middle of a document or different sections of a document that you could link to with the hash ID references, shorthand name references. And it resulted in documents with these empty a name elements, a name and then a name value and close a, and littered them all over the place. Well, since HTML4, you've not had to do that anymore. You can simply use the ID attribute on any element now, and we'll talk more about that later, to specify that this is a named container that you want to reference. So if you have a hyperlink that ends in like hash A1, for example here, it will reference that new div instead of that old a name. This is more semantic and actually helps you refer to a specific section of a document, start and end, containment, rather than just a point in a document. If you still want to refer to a point in a document, great. You can put in a span that encapsulates exactly the specific point you're trying to reference, and you can do that too. Span, ID equals, etc. But most common uses of the ID and the name attribute were to reference whole sections of documents. And for this, you really should be using a div or whatever other semantic markup that encapsulates that section to refer to it and using an ID attribute on it. Similarly, the name attribute on images was being used sometimes in forms. You don't need to be doing this anymore. ID attribute works fine for images as well. And I've added in the closing slash for XHTML compatibility. So those are the bits and pieces of HTML5 that you need to now know in order to transition your HTML4 over to HTML5 and your XHTML as well. There's not that many of them, but they're just enough to be aware of that while you're transitioning them, you need to make sure you make those fixes. So in summary, use CSS instead of presentational markup. You've been hearing this for at least 10 years now, and time is up. HTML5 drops those features. You need to use CSS. Learn to live it and love it. Drop some of these attributes that really have had either no impact or they've been broken for quite some time. Rev, long desk, etc. If you've been using frames, you need to redesign your site to not use frames. In a few cases, like for the JavaScript languages, script tag, you may need to indicate the language explicitly through the type attribute. You don't need to do that in general. However, if you do use really older browsers, you can continue to do so. Update all your references to a names, to using the ID attribute, change your acronyms to abbreviations, change your applets to objects, change your dirs to ULs. Again, not that many.